ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
You can do quite a lot with 3.5 hours of live radio.
Welcome to Radio National Breakfast.
Cyclone Trump has well and truly hit the Middle East.
We cannot leave Belarus as consolation prize for Putin.
Mr. Trump's decision really shocked us.
If I can use the word bollocks on air, I'd use it.
It's almost a redraw of the space race here between America and China.
It is fascinating.
So catch up on the morning's news with a new podcast, The Breakfast Wrap. Search Radio National Breakfast in the Listen app and we'll see you there.
Donald Trump says no nation would be exempt, although perhaps, maybe, Australia could be. As always, the US president's messaging on his plans for a 25% tariff on all aluminium and steel entering the US is contradictory and confusing. Today, economist Susan Stone on the latest front in the trade wars and what it means for us. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Susan, let's unpack Donald Trump's plan to slap a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminium imports. He was actually on the way to the Super Bowl on board Air Force One when we all learnt about this, wasn't he?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, yes. It did seem quite off the cuff.
Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum too.
Yes, it sounded like a sort of throwaway comment, but then, of course, on Monday evening, US time, he signed an executive order relating to this, and at that time he ruled out any exemptions.
It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions, and that's all countries, no matter where it comes from, all countries. If made in the
Except, when he was questioned further, potentially for Australia.
Yes, he did at first say there were no exemptions. Later, they did question that.
The Australian Prime Minister has said that you are considering an exemption for Australia on steel. Is that correct? And why?
I just spoke to him, very fine man, and he has a surplus. We have a surplus with Australia, one of the few. I told him that that's something that we will give great consideration to.
And would you consider one?
It appears that he may set out a hard line and then walk it back. So that might be what's happening here as well.
Yeah, so he says that potentially Australia could be exempt because the US has a trade surplus with us. Just explain what he means by that.
Right now, Australia buys more from the US than we sell to the US. So that means we have a surplus. Trump has said in the past he is very upset with countries with whom the US has a trade deficit, meaning the US buys more goods from that country than they sell to that country. So it's not really a holistic picture of how things work, but he's definitely focused on these trade surpluses and trade deficits.
Apparently, according to him, we import a lot of aeroplanes. He wanted to mention that.
Okay.
And the reason is they buy a lot of airplanes. They are rather far away and they need lots of airplanes.
Anyway. So look, these comments from Donald Trump, they actually came after we'd heard from the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He had a pre-arranged call with the US leader and he was pretty hopeful after that call, wasn't he?
Yes, he did sound upbeat.
I presented Australia's case for an exemption and we agreed on wording to say publicly, which is that the US president agreed that an exemption was under consideration.
The US is a big export market for Australia, but if the US is really concerned about imports of steel and aluminium into the US market, Australia isn't one of the major exporters to the US from the US perspective. When it comes to aluminium, Canada dwarfs the next 10 importers in terms of the amount of aluminium that they account for in exporting to the U.S. So it could be that if Trump wants to focus on the major countries that export to the U.S. in these products, Australia may be able to get an exemption because it's not one of these major exporters.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk a bit further about that, Susan, in a moment, about what a 25% tariff on, these metals from here might do to the industry that's operating out of Australia. But back to the diplomacy, Joe Courtney, a Democrat from Connecticut, he's actually a chair of a Friends of Australia group. He says this would be a total insult to the Australian people because we've just passed over a cheque for US shipbuilding as part of the AUKUS Defence Pact.
What we're seeing is a completely needless, almost insult to the people of Australia by raising tariffs of Australian products coming into this country. At the same time, we are working with them, and they are buying 3 nuclear submarines. So again,
do you think Donald Trump takes anything like that into account?
I think that the economics of it would certainly play into it. He's very transactional in his approach to these things. I noticed that Joe Courtney also mentioned the fact that there was no discount and that Australia paid full price for these submarines and therefore we're being a straight up economic partner. I think that will definitely carry weight. Whether or not we have a free trade agreement, those things, I'm not sure how much that plays into it, as we've seen with Canada and Mexico. There's a free trade agreement there as well. But these kinds of transactional programs that are already in place and that have been implemented, to the extent that they have, would influence how he perceives of the relationship between Australia and the US.
All right, and we've been here before, of course.
Right.
Last time Donald Trump was in power, Malcolm Turnbull managed, back then when he was the Prime Minister, managed to negotiate Australia's way out of those tariffs. That really did come down to the trade surplus again, didn't it?
Yes, these things played into the general perception that Australia wasn't, quote unquote, taking advantage of the US and therefore could still be allowed access to the markets.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull, of course, has been speaking quite a bit in the past few days about his successes, although he does say let's not judge Anthony Albanese too harshly if Trump doesn't exempt us.
I know people are trying to set Albanese up to fail here, let's be honest. It may be that Trump is determined to impose this tariff on every country no matter what, and in which case it won't be possible to secure an exemption.
Now, let's just turn to the industry, Susan, here then. As you say, really, we're not a huge exporter of steel and aluminium to America, but still a 25% tariff, that would affect the industry, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely it would affect them because while we don't export a lot from the U.S. perspective, from Australia's perspective, we do. I mean, it's one of our biggest exports markets for aluminium. It's the top for steel, and it's probably in the top 5 for aluminium. And that means from Australia's perspective, these are major markets. And if you were to put a 25% tariff, it would have significant impact on the industry. That's assuming everybody had the 25% tariff. If for some reason, Argentina or some of the other smaller importers that were exempted last time were given an exemption and Australia wasn't, that would make things even worse because there would still be that option to import, but it wouldn't be from Australia. So this has very significant domestic implications if he does go ahead and put the 25% tariff on Australian exports.
But of course, we could retaliate, right? So could every other nation.
Every other nation could. And certainly the European Union has indicated that it's going to. We haven't really heard much from Japan and Korea. They're also major steel exporters to the U.S. They also have trade surpluses with the U.S., so they may not be eligible for an exemption if you use that as a criteria. But yeah, I mean, a lot of tariffs on these other countries, if they do decide to retaliate, That history has shown just leads to a race to the bottom in terms of economic outcomes, because not only does it increase costs, but it increased risk, it increased uncertainty. All of these things are not good for doing business, engaging in contracts. We already have a lot of uncertainty in the energy markets. Adding it to the steel and aluminium would just create a very big headache for the manufacturing sector in most countries.
Yeah, and it could be actually pretty bad for the United States, really, couldn't it? I mean, the president says it will make America rich again, but that's not really the case, is it?
If history is a guide, no, not at all. I mean, from the steel tariffs that were imposed from 2018, America lost jobs actually in the steel industry, and they have not recovered those jobs. So the overall job losses from those tariffs have still not been recovered. And I mean, we've had COVID in between, so it's really hard to tell. But most studies have indicated that those industries did take a big hit. And it kind of just increases cost. And most of those costs will fall on the U.S. consumer. Even though Trump does say that over the long run, it's going to return manufacturing to the U.S. and that's going to help U.S., become rich again, the data really kind of doesn't support that outcome.
All right, well, Susan, this does all sound very much like a trade war brewing. At the heart of that, really, though, is China, right? Trump really wants to hit China, but China isn't really impacted by this announcement, is it?
No, well, I mean, to the extent it still exports some steel to the U.S., but not very much, because the 2018, a lot of those tariffs are still in place. And China has shifted a lot of its markets elsewhere. So this isn't really going to impact them directly. But of course, to the extent that it causes movement of global trade in steel and aluminium, it will impact them, and it will impact the markets they do sell to. So in the European Union and other places, that could be more competition for China in these third markets, and we could see that have an impact on prices there.
I was going to say, how does this change the global market? Can we just send our steel and aluminium elsewhere to avoid this tariff?
Well, everybody's going to be thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
That's the only problem. It won't stop importing. It can't do that. You can't turn things around on a dime. Like aluminium, the U.S. imports more than half of the aluminium used, and it imports about 25% of steel. So for the manufacturing sectors to ramp up to replace imports does take time. And they need to get the resources, the people, the energy, the inputs to be able to do that. And that's going to take time, and that's going to take money. So in the meantime, U.S. manufacturers that demand steel and aluminium will still need to continue to import it. It's just a matter of the degree to which they have to reduce their own margins and not increase their prices, or the degree to which their markets allow them to increase prices. If they're competing in international markets that aren't having those same tariffs put on their inputs, then U.S. manufacturers are going to lose out in those markets. So it really is very detrimental to the whole system.
All right. Well, Susan, what do you think? Do you think Anthony Albanese will be successful in getting us out of this time?
I actually do think it has less to do with, personalities and much more to do with if we can make a very cogent and impactful argument about how Australia's imports of steel and aluminium are no threat to America's manufacturing revival, or no threat to the United States and its position in terms of having a trade deficit or a surplus. And then hopefully we'll have the manufacturing sector, on the other hand, lobbying the Trump administration to allow at least some imports in on an exempted basis so that they can still get access to that necessary input to their processes. And hopefully Australia will be in that group that is seen as non-threatening and is able to then continue exporting to the market.
I guess with Trump, we just have to wait and see.
That's correct.
Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Susan Stone is the Credit Union SA Chair of Economics at the University of South Australia. This episode was produced by Sydney Peat, Cara Jensen McKinnon, audio production by Sam Dunn and Adair Shepherd. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.